Hello students, I am Dr. Harpreet Kaur from Army Institute of Law, Mohali. I'll be discussing with you the topic of critical examination of Doctrine of Basic Structure. The Doctrine of Basic Structure is considered the most potent tool in the hands of the Indian judiciary to maintain the balance of power, the check and the balance that are required for the smooth functioning of a democracy. This doctrine has altered the course of Indian constitutional law jurisprudence. Additionally, it is believed that the doctrine of basic structure is applicable to the constitutional amendments exclusively. However, various judges of the Supreme Court have viewed this aspect differently, and there have been contrasting opinions on this subject. Since this does not appear to be a straightforward concept anymore, with the doctrine's applicability in dispute, the Constitution of India is dynamic, creative, and eloquent text. It is a foregone conclusion that it must always reflect invariably the values, politics, and the social-economic objectives of the country it governs. There will always be an underlying, noticeable, or unseen conflict, thus trying to balance the revolutionary, social, and political reform and maintaining the Constitution itself. The judiciary has played a significant role in interpreting the Indian Constitution. It is the judiciary that has done its hardest to uphold the constitutional framework of the Indian Constitution. India's constitution came not out of the vacuum. It is a continuous process of evolution, reformation, and recreation by eminent scholars, experts, and judges, and so on, of the existing governance system. It must react to the new developments and take into consideration unexpected and unprepared incidents that did not fall inside the scope of the Constitution's contemplation. Ours is the living Constitution that needs a transition from time to time due to the developments in the society. Parliament can modify, mold, change, vary, or abolish any provision of the Constitution under its legislative capacity. Now, what is the doctrine of basic structure? The basic structure doctrine has played a significant role in shaping the Indian constitutional law. It has been used by the Indian judiciary to strike down several constitutional amendments that were deemed to violate the basic structure. This doctrine has been instrumental in upholding the integrity and stability of the Indian Constitution and maintaining the balance of power between the three branches of the government. It is important to note that the basic structure doctrine is specific to Indian legal system and may not be applicable in other jurisdictions. It is a unique feature of Indian constitutional law and has had a profound impact on the interpretation and development of the Indian Constitution. The basic structure doctrine is not explicitly mentioned in the text of Indian Constitution. However, it has been developed and recognized as a legal principle by the Supreme Court of India through its interpretation of various constitutional provisions. The doctrine finds its root in the landmark case of Keshwanand Bharti versus State of Kerala, which is of 1973. In this case, the Supreme Court held that although the Parliament has the power to amend the Constitution under Article 368, such amending power cannot be used to destroy or alter the basic structure of the Constitution. While the doctrine is not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, It derives its legitimacy from several constitutional provisions and principles. Some of the key provisions and principles that form the basic structure of the doctrine of the basic structure are as follows. First is the preamble. The preamble of the Indian Constitution enshrines the basic principle and objectives of the Constitution such as liberty, justice, equality and fraternity. The basic structure doctrine draws its strength from the idea that these principles are foundational and cannot be tampered with by the amending power of the Parliament. Next is the fundamental rights. Part 3 of the Indian Constitution guarantees fundamental rights to all citizens. These rights include the right to equality, freedom of speech and expression, the right to life and personal liberty, and more. The basic structure doctrine protects these fundamental rights as an essential components of the basic structure of the Constitution. Next, we have directive principles of the state policy. Part 4 of the Constitution contains the directive principles of the state policies, which are guiding principles for the government to promote social justice, equality and welfare. The basic structure doctrine ensures that amendment cannot comprise the core principles and objectives of the directive principles. Coming to the separation of powers, the Constitution establishes a system of separation of power between the legislature, executive and the judiciary. The basic structure doctrine protects the separation of powers as a fundamental feature of the Constitution, ensuring that no single organ of the government becomes disproportionately powerful. The judicial review. The power of the judicial review is implicit in the Constitution, allowing the judiciary to interpret and uphold the Constitution. The basic structure doctrine empowers the judiciary to review and strike down the constitutional amendments that violate the basic structure. It is important to note that specific elements considered part of the basic structure have evolved through judicial interpretation over the time. The Supreme Court has identified several components such as supremacy of the Constitution, rule of law, independence of the judiciary, secularism, federalism, and more as part of the basic structure. The argument over the Constitution's basic foundation, sitting prominently in the records of the political past of India during the last decade of the 20th century, has reappeared in the public domain. During the establishment of National Commission for reviewing the working of the Constitution, the Commission, the Government of National Democratic Alliance, and the regional state that the basic structure of the Constitution would not be altered. The chairman of the Commission, Justice M.N. Venkatle, has emphasized on many occasions that an inquiry into the fundamental framework of the Constitution is outside the domain of the work of the Commission. In 1973, the Supreme Court in Keshwanand Bharti v. State of Kerala declared that the basic structure doctrine in India, the basic structural review, is an independent and distinct type of constitutional judicial review that applies to all forms of state actions to ensure that such action does not damage or destroy the basic structure of the Constitution. Such basic legislative characteristics are defined by a common law methodology, which are fundamental procedural principles that are enforced by many legislative clauses. The fundamental theory of the system and all forms of substantive judicial review has a clear legislative basis and is based on a clear and justifiable reading of the Constitution. The legitimacy of the review of basic structures can be assessed in three legal categories: legal, moral, and sociological. By defending a structuralist interpretation as a coherent and justifiable model of constitutional interpretation, the legal legitimacy of such review is set. The philosophical validity of fundamental framework analysis relies on opposing majoritarian model of government and embracing a dualistic form of deliberative decision making in representative society. To a significant degree, the sociological validity of the theory is dependent on effectiveness of the claim of religious and legal authority. The basic structure doctrine is a judge-made doctrine in which certain features of India's constitution go beyond the limit of Indian Parliament amending power. On 27 February 1967, in the leading case of Golaknath versus State of Punjab, a special bench of 11 judges ruled that Parliament has no power to amend Part 3 of the Constitution to abolish or abridge the constitutional freedom. On 24 April 1973, a special bench comprising of 13 Supreme Court judges of India judges held that Article 368 of the Constitution does not allow the Parliament to alter its basic structure or constitutional framework, while court overruled the Golaknath decision and held that only constitutional rights could be changed. It also held that other aspects of the Constitution could not be changed, in turn proposing the doctrine of fundamental structure. Sajjan Singh's basic characteristics of the Constitution, when he used the phrase to argue that there are certain characteristics of the Constitution that the Parliament cannot amend by its amending power under Article 368 of the Constitution. The Constitution provides that Parliament and the Indian state legislatures have the power to make laws within their respective jurisdictions. In the judiciary, the Constitution holds the power to judge the constitutional validity of all laws. The Supreme Court has the right to declare such a statute null or ultra vires if a law enacted by the Parliament or the state legislatures contradict any clause of the Constitution. Notwithstanding this test, the Founding Fathers intended the Constitution to be more an adaptable text than a fixed governing structure. Therefore, Parliament was empowered to change the Constitution. Article 368 of the Constitution gives the impression that the amending power of this Parliament are absolute and cover all part of the document. Yet since independence, the Supreme Court has been serving as a check upon Parliament's constitutional zeal. Intending to preserve the constitution makers' original ideals, the Apex Court ruled that under the pretext of amending it, Parliament could not distort, damage or alter the basic feature of the Constitution. The actual term basic structure cannot be included in the Constitution itself. Now coming to the concept of Indian judiciary and the basic structure of the doctrine. The basic structure doctrine is a key constitutional principle in India that limits the power of the Parliament to amend certain fundamental features of the Constitution. According to this doctrine, certain core principles and values cannot be altered through constitutional amendments. The Supreme Court of India has used the basic structure doctrine to strike down several constitutional amendments over the years. Here are some notable cases related to the basic structure doctrine in the Indian Constitution. First is the Keshwanand Bharti versus State of Kerala 1973. This landmark case is widely considered the most significant case regarding the basic structure doctrine. The Supreme Court, in a historic decision, held that Parliament can amend any part of the Constitution but cannot alter its basic structure. The judgment laid down the basic structure doctrine and established that certain fundamental features such as supremacy of the Constitution, secularism, democracy, federalism and judicial review are beyond the amending power of the Parliament. The next case is Indira Gandhi versus Raj Narayan of year 1975. In this case, the Supreme Court invoked the basic structure doctrine to strike down certain provisions of the 39th Amendment Act, which was passed by the Parliament to nullify the court's judgment in the election case against the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. The court held that the amendments violated the basic structure of free and fair election. The next case is Minerva Mill Limited versus Union of India of year 1980. In this case, the Supreme Court used the basic structure doctrine to invalidate certain provisions of the 42nd Amendment Act, which was passed during the emergency period. The court held that the amendment violated the basic structure and undermined the independence of judiciary. The next important case is Swayam Rao versus Union of India of year 1981. In this case, the Supreme Court reiterated the basic structure doctrine and held that power of judicial review is an essential and integral feature of the Constitution's basic structure. The court struck down certain provisions of the 42nd Amendment Act which sought to curtail the scope of judicial review. The leading case of S.R. Bommai versus Union of India of year 1994. In this case, the Supreme Court applied the basic structure doctrine in the context of federalism. The court held that secularism and federalism are basic features of the Constitution and cannot be abrogated by the Parliament. The judgment clarified that any attempt to undermine the democratic fabric or secular ethos of the nation would violate the basic structure. Now, I will be discussing with you the impact of the basic structure doctrine. Basic structure doctrine in the Indian Constitution continues to be an essential principle in constitutional jurisprudence in India. The impact of the basic structure doctrine on the Indian Constitution has been profound and far-reaching. Here are some key impacts. First is limitation on the amending power. The basic structure doctrine establishes a limitation on the amending power of the Parliament. It ensures that Parliament cannot amend the Constitution in a manner that infringes upon or destroys the basic structure. This limitation has helped maintain the integrity and stability of the Constitution, preventing arbitrary changes that could undermine its fundamental principle. Next is the protection of the fundamental rights. The basic structure doctrine has played a significant role in safeguarding the fundamental rights in India. It ensures that any constitutional amendment that seeks to dilute or curtail these rights is subject to judicial scrutiny. This has led to the protection and expansion of the individual liberties and human rights in the country. Balancing powers. The doctrine has helped maintain a balance of powers among the three branches of the government in India. By preventing the Parliament from excessively encroaching upon the powers of the judiciary or other constitutional bodies, it ensures the separation of powers and prevent any single institution from becoming dominant. The next is judicial activism. The basic structure doctrine has encouraged judicial activism in India. The judiciary has actively interpreted and applied the doctrine to strike down constitutional amendments that violate the basic structure. This activism has strengthened the role of the judiciary as the protector of the Constitution and a check on the legislative and executive branches. Evolution of constitutional law. The doctrine has allowed for the evolution of constitutional law in India. It has given the judiciary the flexibility to adapt the concept of basic structure to changing social, economic and political realities. As a result, the Indian Constitution has been able to respond to emerging challenges and developments while preserving its core values. Next is the stability and the continuity. The basic structure doctrine has contributed to the stability and the continuity of the Indian Constitution. By protecting the basic structure from arbitrary amendments, it ensures that the constitutional framework remains intact, even during the times of political changes or shifting power dynamics. Next is protection of secularism and federalism. The doctrine has been instrumental in upholding the principles of secularism and federalism in India. It prevents amendments that may undermine the secular fabric of the nation or alter the federal structure of the governance. This protection ensures the preservation of India's diverse and pluralistic society. The democratic values. the basic structure doctrine reinforces democratic values in India by safeguarding the principles of democracy such as free and fair elections, parliamentary accountability, and the rule of law. It strengthens the democratic framework of the country and protects the rights and freedoms of its citizens. Now coming to the critical analysis of the basic structure doctrine. It is widely accepted and understood that the validity of an ordinary legislation can be tested on two grounds, namely legislative competence and whether or not it attracts the bar of Article 13 Clause 1 and Article 13 Clause 2 of the Constitution. This was also held by Y.V. Chandrachud in paragraph 691 of his separate judgment in Keshwanand Bharti case. The question here arises that can the validity of the ordinary legislation be tested on the anvil of the basic structure doctrine, meaning thereby that can an ordinary legislation be invalidated by the Union Judiciary on the ground that it is violative of the basic structure doctrine in addition to the already two existing aforestated ground. In the election case, 3 out of 5 judges held that an ordinary legislation is not subject to the test of basic structure doctrine. However, Justice Beg refuted this finding while Justice Khanna declined to decide this, as it was not germane to the decision of the case. In State of Karnataka versus Union of India, this case is of year 1977, quoted at page number 608. Chief Justice Beg said that if, as a result of the doctrine, certain imperatives are inherent in or logically and necessarily flows from the Constitution's basic structure, just as though they are at its express mandates, they can be and have to be used to test the validity of the ordinary law, just as the other part of the Constitution so used. A 5 judges bench in Kuldeep Nair versus Union of India of year 2006 unanimously held in paragraph 106 that the doctrine of basic feature in the context of our Constitution thus does not apply to the ordinary legislation. In case of Madras Bar Association versus Union of India, it is also known as entity case. The constitutional validity of the National Tax Tribunal Act of 2005 was challenged along with the calling into the question of the constitutional validity of the 42nd Amendment Act of 1976 on the ground that it violates the basic structure of the Constitution by impugning the power of judicial review of the High Courts. An alternate point that was made was that the National Tax Tribunal was an extrajudicial body and cannot substitute the jurisdiction of High Courts by discharging judicial functions. Justice Kehar, writing for the majority, concluded that the Parliament had the power to enact a legislation and to vest adjudicatory functions earlier vested in the High Court with an alternative court or tribunal. Exercise of this power would not per se violate the basic structure of the Constitution. The basic structure of the Constitution would stand violated if, while enacting such a legislation, the Parliament does not ensure that the newly constituted court or tribunal confirms the standard and salient characteristics of the court sought to be substituted. This would also be violative of the constitutional conventions pertaining to the Constitution styled on the Westminster's model. On these parameters, certain essential provisions of the Entity Act were struck down as being unconstitutional, and since these provisions were critical to the Act, consequently, the Entity Act was itself declared to be unconstitutional. Following is the criticism of the basic structure doctrine. First, judicial overreach. Critics argue that the basic structure doctrine grants excessive power to the judiciary, potentially resulting in the judicial overreach. They contended that unelected judges should not have the authority to determine the limits of the constitutional amendments, as this power should reside with the elected representative of the people. Second is the lack of clarity and certainty. The basic structure doctrine lacks precise definition and clarity regarding the components that constitute the basic structure. This lack of clarity allows for subject interpretation and creates uncertainty, making it challenging to predict the outcome of the challenges to the constitutional amendments. Third is the political controversy and the polarization. The doctrine can give rise to political controversy and polarization. When constitutional amendments are invalidated on the grounds of violating the basic structure, it can generate divisions and conflicts among different political and ideological groups. This can hinder the smooth functioning of the legislative process and impact the governance. Fourth is the potential rigidity. Some argue that the doctrine's protection of basic structure may be perceived as inflexible and rigid. Critics contend that it restricts the ability to adapt the Constitution to evolving circumstances and emerging needs. They argue for more flexible in constitutional amendments to address evolving challenges without the risk of being invalidated for violating the basic structure. It is important to note that the merits and demerits of the basic structure doctrine are subject to differing opinions and perspectives. The impact and implications of the doctrine can vary depending on the specific context and the individuals involved in the application. Concluding my topic, I can say, over the years, the Supreme Court has been applying the doctrine of basic structure to invalidate the ordinary legislations, sometimes directly, at other times tangentially. In Indira Sahni versus Union of India, this is a Supreme Court judgment of year 2000, Kerala State Backward Classes Reservation of Appointment or Post in the Service under the State Act 1995 on creamy layer was held to be violative of the basic structure of the Constitution. In L. Chandra Kumar versus Union of India, the Supreme Court held that Clause 2D of Article 323A and Clause 3D of Article 323B, to the extent they exclude the jurisdiction of the High Courts and the Supreme Court under Article 226 and 227 and 32 of the Constitution, are unconstitutional. Section 28 of the Impugned Act and the exclusion of jurisdiction clauses in all other legislations enacted under the edges of Article 323A and 323B were to the same extent held to be unconstitutional. The Supreme Court stated that the jurisdiction conferred upon the High Courts under Article 226 and 227 and upon the Supreme Court under Article 32 of the Constitution is part of the inviolable basic structure of the Constitution. In S.R. Bommai versus Union of India, the concept of basic structure was resorted to, although no question of constitutional amendment was involved in that case. The Supreme Court held that the policies of a state government directed against an element of the basic structure of the Constitution would be a valid ground for the exercise of central power under Article 356, that is, the imposition of the President's rule. There have been arguments for the doctrine of basic structure against the basic structures and third schools of the thought that denies the existence of anything called unamendable basic structure of the Constitution. The third school believes that people revolted not against the non-essential parts of the Constitution but against its essential ones if they became an obstacle in their progress. That ultimate legal sovereignty resides in the people. Therefore, if amendments were to help a constitution to survive, they must include changes in the allegedly essential part of the Constitution. Wherever one may place their allegiance, it is undeniable that the doctrine of basic structure is essential to the constitutionalism in India, as has been proved in the Indira Gandhi era, where this doctrine was only shield standing between an all-powerful parliament and the people, owing to the legislative excesses by reckless usage of Article 368. That's all for today's lecture. See you in next lecture. Till then, thank you and goodbye.